Much ouch. I am. I can't write, can't use a keyboard.
I'll say this though, technology does make it a lot better than when I screwed up and was in a sort of cast. Because now we have surprisingly good text to speech.
Well, yeah, it's just a matter of, I guess I'm doing what I've got to do for the meantime, but everything is like about 4 times, 5 times slower than it should be. Because I'm only just typing with one hand, and this is not my dominant hand. So, all things considered, there are just some things I can't do anymore. Yes. Okay, welcome everyone. As you can see, I've had a little bit of a minor accident. So for those of you who try and send me emails or what have you during normal class time, be aware my email writing reply skills are not very good right now. Given that my right hand, which I broke, is my dominant hand, so I can't really reply to too many emails. So if you want a long explanation of something, could I ask you to either ask the question here in the lecture where I can reply to it, or ask your tutors. You can also put it up on the discussion forum, and Helen will generally reply to it in most cases. I can usually do yes or no answers. Apart from that, no, you're probably not going to get a reply anytime soon if you're looking for a page explanation of anything. That just isn't going to happen. So, okay, I'll try and get the results together. I'm beginning to collate that, and I've told, for assignment 1, and I've told the tutors that as they give me their spreadsheets and I check them over, they can start handing back assignments. So some of you will probably already have a few assignments coming back, others may come back tomorrow. Hopefully we'll get the bulk of them back to people by next week. But some tutors are a bit quicker than others in doing the marking, so it really just depends upon how long it takes them to get things done. And for a class that has 270 odd people enrolled in it, the lecture theatres are getting smaller and smaller. That's all right, you know, small, intimate group. I appreciate you turning up. I know it's tough on a 7:30 on a Thursday night. I know how difficult that is. Okay, tonight we're going to be talking a bit about resourcing, costing and budgeting, because this is one of the outcomes that you're looking at when you come to, you know, once you've got your tasks and your requirements set out, you've got to figure out how you're going to deliver on them now. So when we're looking at this, we need to figure out what resources we have in order to do the tasks that we've accepted. We've talked about network diagrams. We'll talk a little bit about the differences between those and Gantt charts tonight. Sources of project delay, the types of resources we can call upon, and a little bit about cost management in terms of estimates and baselines. So again, you'll have my project life cycle diagram up. None of you have any excuse for not knowing what those 5 phases are. And the 10 knowledge areas of which we have now covered most of them. And we'll be talking a little bit about these 2 tonight. Now this is all at a high level, of course. You won't be able to graduate from this particular course with anything other than 6 credit points, assuming everyone gets through the final exam. You won't be able to call yourself project managers. That isn't the intent of this particular subject. It's really just to make you aware of what project managers do, so that if you find yourself in a project environment, and if you're going to be in the IT or information systems industry, you will, then you have some idea of what they're talking about when they talk about risk registers and task decomposition, and how important it is to manage budgets, and why person X is better than person Y to do a particular task. These are the characteristics that come into play when you're running a project. So you won't be project managers, but you'll get a bit of an idea of the hustle and bustle that project managers have to go through. From the outside, if a project is run well, it looks like the project manager is doing very little. In actual fact, they're doing a hell of a lot to make it look like they're doing very little. And I know that sounds very counterintuitive, but the thing is, one of the jobs of a project manager is to try and remove problems before they occur to anyone else. and the work that they go through in order to be able to minimise the problems that get inflicted upon other people can be quite large. So they put a lot of work into making the job of the project team as easy as possible, and sometimes that means they're a little bit underappreciated. But the reality on this one is you can only have a successful project if you've got a good project manager running the show. Part of the process for being a good project manager is also understanding the numbers, understanding the differences in people's capability, understanding things like PERT and when a task should start and when a task should stop. Because the earlier that you realise something is going wrong, the more time you've got to fix it. If the only time you find out that something has gone a little bit screwing on you is 3 hours before a major deadline, you've got very little time to pull a rabbit out of a hat. If you can work it out weeks ahead, you've got a lot more time to do things. So we've gone through activity on the node PERT charts last week, and you'll probably get a little bit of experience of that in some of the tutorials. I would encourage you to know how things like the forward pass and the backward pass and the working out of the critical path works for a PERT. These are very simple PERTs we're talking about. Literally, these diagrams, network diagrams, can cover an entire wall if you've got thousands and thousands of tasks. So I'm just giving you a little bit of a taste of how complicated they can get. But until you know how to run with something like this, you don't necessarily know how long your project is going to take. Because if you put all of the tasks nose to tail in a serial fashion, a project can take 5 years. If you're able to work out where your resources of parallelism and everything else is, then you can collapse that down to 18 months. Now that's a very important thing to know. Because at some point, if you're working in a project environment, you may be asked to estimate how long things are going to take or how long the overall project will take. So let's take a look at some estimates constructed from the work breakdown structure. So here's an example of a very simple 8-point task list work breakdown structure. We're going to look at the bottom up, and then we're going to put it on the task sequence. So I've created a work sequence down here that says 1.1 comes before 1.2, which comes before 1.3, and at 1.3 we have a branch because 1.4 can be done at the same time as 1.5. Other people might draw this differently. Sometimes there is no right answer to it. It's just what you decide given the knowledge that you have about the task list and the importance of the requirements that you're playing with. Ultimately, if everything works out well, you should be able to do both paths in parallel, complete them on time, and then get on to task 1.8, and then you're finished. But it all comes down to how you map these out. So if we have 8 tasks and we say, okay, 1.1 will be 2 days, 1.2 will be 5 days, 1.3 will be 1 day, we add them all up at the end, and that becomes 18 days. This is our bottom-up estimate because we start with the lowest level tasks and then we add them all up to get a summary number. So in my project plan, I can go and say the test results report is going to take 18 days. And you can do the same thing for a phase within the project, and you can say that phase will take me 37 days. And then you can wrap those phases up into the project plan and work out how long across all of the phases the actual project itself might take, and the project itself might be 237 working days. But until you know how to work these numbers, until you know where the parallelism is, until you know your estimates and how long they're going to take, you don't know how long the project overall will take. So working with these numbers is actually kind of important. Because if you look at it, if you were doing it straight from the work breakdown structure and trying to analyse how long this particular phase would take, you would come up with 18 days. However, when you start mapping them against a parallel sequence like the one at the bottom there, you find you can actually save 2 days and do it in 16. That's a 2-day saving out of 18 days, which is actually quite a lot. That's over or almost, what, 15%, 10%? That 2 days can be quite critical when you're coming up on a deadline. So the more parallelism you can get into your sequence, the less nose to tail you have for your task list, the quicker you can finish your project, assuming you have the resources to do all of the different paths at the same time. So that's your assumption, infinite resources at the beginning. But at some point then you have to come along and map these onto a schedule and put resources against them. So this is what we're going to talk about now. Activity schedule is a Gantt chart. Once we have our network diagram and we've worked out our sequence of tasks, we should be able to then think about, okay, if we put these on a calendar schedule, what does that look like? A Gantt is a standard for displaying project schedule information, a task list with start and finish dates in a calendar format. And this is the difference between a PERT chart or any network diagram and a Gantt chart. The Gantt chart is mapped against a real-time calendar. It has a specific start date, it has a specific end date for the different tasks and the project overall. With a network diagram, we're not dealing with dates, we're dealing with elapsed time. So we start at time 0 and then we go out for however many days are in the project, 200 odd days, whatever it happens to be. So we're counting days. So this is an example of a simple Gantt chart that you could really just put together using any number of different tools. If we map the two of them together, it kind of looks like this. So when you look at a network diagram versus a Gantt chart, you can see on the network diagram we've got 16 days left, but you can also see for the test report on the Gantt chart that we've got 16 days. We've also got a critical path which is mapped by the red arrows on the network diagram at the top and mapped by the red lines or the red bars on the Gantt chart. Now, I have had people in the exams when I've asked the question, what's the difference between a Gantt chart and a network diagram? One of the things that has often been said, and which is wrong, is that you can't map a critical path on a Gantt chart. Of course you can. This very diagram here shows you can put a critical path on a Gantt chart. It's just easier to see on a network diagram once you've worked out floats, and then you transfer that across to the Gantt chart. There is no rationale on the Gantt chart itself down here that you can see for why those red bars are the critical path. So if you're only looking at a Gantt chart in isolation, you can't justify why one path or one set of bars is red and another is blue, because it's very difficult to see the rationale for a critical path on a Gantt chart. You can see the critical path, but you just can't see why. On a network diagram, you can work it out from the float numbers. So, Gantt charts map a schedule. Network diagrams map a sequence. Advantages of network display diagrams over Gantt charts and vice versa. And this one has appeared in previous exams. Focus on, for the activity, network display diagrams, focus on activity sequence and precedence. What comes before a task? What comes after a task? Can tasks be done at the same time? Do they have prerequisites or not? Do they have multiple prerequisites? Do you have to finish this task before you can start the next phase of the project? These are all of the things that come into play. Okay, I've just realised I haven't been speaking with a microphone. Have you been hearing me up the back there okay? Okay. I'll see if I can do it with a microphone this time. It might be easier rather than me yelling at you. That's a little better. Okay, is that coming through? Can you hear me? Is that clear on the microphone? Excellent. Okay. So, easy visual of activities, because one of the benefits of a network diagram is it communicates. If you put it up on a wall, you're going to have someone come along and say, here we are on the diagram, we're at this point. A network diagram is a map. It's a map of progress. So you can point to where you are and say, this is the geography of where we are in our journey to finish this particular project. You're very useful on complex projects and with inexperienced project managers and team members, because it helps them keep a visual in their heads. People are very visual. About 80% of your information intake is through the eyes. So if you can see a diagram, that is much better than people telling you. If you can actually see it up on the wall and there's a little red arrow that says you are here, then you know at this point we've executed 80% of the project, we've only got about 20% to go. We're getting close to the end. Or maybe we're not, maybe we're falling behind. The thing is, network diagrams can be rather difficult to keep updated forever. They require a lot of work, especially on very complex projects, because task lists keep changing around. If you keep changing the tasks around and then you've got to go and update your PERT chart or your network diagram on a regular basis, it can be very useful to do so, but it's also very time consuming. And depending on how many people you've got on your project who are able to do it, it often will get put aside. It's excellent for understanding where the activity parallelism, but once you've got the thing underway, you tend to find that sometimes the project managers, once they have their Gantt chart created from their network diagram, they just then update the Gantt chart. And the PERT chart or the network diagram is either done and kept at a very high level, and the detailed one is just kept for historical reasons. And that is purely a resource constraint on the project manager. If they had a lot more time, they can keep both of them updated. But if they have to sacrifice one, they never sacrifice the Gantt chart. Because the Gantt chart is the calendar representation, and that's the one everyone wants to know. You said you were going to finish this task by the 11th. Have you finished it by the 11th? This is the word that comes down from on high, from your steering committee or from your senior managers. So network display diagrams, you'll often see them at the beginning of the project, and then you'll tend to find that they are kept at a high level or not updated at a detailed level once the project is underway. And in many ways that's a bit of a shame, but it's purely an operational decision. The project manager only has so many hours to put into their day, and they just can't do everything. Advantages of Gantt charts, it maps a real-time calendar. So you can say, okay, in the next 2 weeks from this date to that date, we need to do this number of tasks. Thank God for weekends, because I'm going to make my team work this coming weekend, because we've got 10 days to do 12 days of tasks. So I'm going to ask them to work the weekend. This is where it comes into play in terms of one of the advantages of Gantt charts. Being able to map that real-time calendar and seeing where it comes in allows you to manipulate free days a little bit, weekends, public holidays, and you'll often find project managers asking team members to work on public holidays during critical periods in order to keep a project on track. And that will give them the day back as a day off at some other point. Usually there's a negotiation that comes into play at this point. If you work for me on Anzac Day, I will give you 2 days off in a month's time, once we're past our deadline. So these things can be negotiable, depending upon the relative requirements of the deadlines. It's easy to compare back to a project baseline because, do you know what a baseline is? Do you remember what a baseline is? What's a baseline? What is a baseline? Please tell me you know what a baseline is. The baseline is 1.0 of any project plan, the very, very first one that you start with. The foundation project plan from which all other changes are applied against. So when someone talks about a baseline of a project plan, it's version 1.0. When someone talks about the baseline for their budget, it's the very first budget you came up with for the project. If someone talks about your resource plan baseline, it's the first resourcing activity exercise that you did for the project, because they all change. I mean, look at the, Android Galaxy. It's up to what, version 7 or version 8 of that phone by now? Apple iPhone is pretty much the same. You measure the change in functionality by having a look at the latest version of that versus the very first Samsung phone or the very first Apple iPhone, and the change in functionality. That very first iteration was the baseline. Everything after that is measured against that baseline. We do the same thing with Gantt charts. Because if you're running late on a project, you get to the end of it and you brought it in a month over your time budget, your boss is going to say, Grant, why, you promised that we could do this in 12 months. Why did you take 13? It's like you failed your project. I'm not going to give you your bonuses and you don't have a job when you come in next week. I can go back to the documentation, I can go back to the baseline, I can have a look at all of the change requests that have come through since then, and I can make a case that the reason that we ran a month over is because my boss kept coming and asking for changes that added another 3 months to the project, but I was bloody good and was able to bring it in only 1 month late rather than 3, as his changes would normally mandate. This is why it's important to sometimes keep documentation so you can make these arguments. You've got to explain things after the fact, because in the project implementation wash-up, the post-implementation review, once all of the work has been done, you need to be able to go back and look at the lessons, the good ones and the bad ones. What did we do well? What did we do poorly? What did we learn from the experience? What will we do better next time? What lessons should we document and pass over to the next group of project managers undertaking a project? How do we improve? This is education for project managers. This is how project managers learn, by talking to other people or looking at the outlines of previous project plans, so they can run their project better than whoever their predecessor was. But part of this is that you have to be able to have the previous information to compare. If you keep updating against the original baseline, and you change that from baseline 1.0 of your project plan, and eventually you get up to like 6.7, but you've been updating the same document over and over, you can't go back and see what all the changes were. So when someone says your project ran late and you're the one to blame, you haven't got any audit trail to help you out. So the trick here is, when you update a document like this, always keep the previous versions of the documents. They become part of the project library. You copy what you have, rename it, update that one. Go from 1.0 to 1.1, and then 1.2, and then 1.3, but you've kept all the previous documents, especially with Gantt charts, because you need to see what the schedules were. Provide a common reference modes that are used in every single project. Whereas network diagrams are used at the beginning, and then maybe a summary is kept updated for most projects, especially complex ones, unless it's absolutely required. A Gantt chart will be used on every single project. I have seen networks diagrammed employed on probably about 50% of projects, but as I said, they tend to get less detailed over time and only look at the summary items. But a Gantt chart, every single day, that gets updated. When I was a project manager, every single day. Every single project I've ever looked at, other project managers were running. When I had teams of project managers working for me, I could go to them and I could say, give me your Gantt chart. And they could show me the latest version, which by that time is probably only a few hours old. These things get updated every single day. This is a living and breathing document. If you have a project plan put on a Gantt chart, and you ask for it as a senior manager, and your project manager gives it to you, and the date is about 6 weeks ago, someone is not doing their job. Because you can't keep 6 weeks of changes to your project plan in your head. Primary tool of project managers, most will understand it, it's the common language for project managers. It's best to use both, but you'll often find that the network display diagram is the one that often is put aside or sacrificed, or just it transitions to a summary mode. And that's purely a resource constraint. So some causes of project delay linked to estimating, because this is one of the arts of project management. If you're a good estimator, if you know that a task will take 20 days and you can call it 20 days and it is 20 days and you can do that time after time, you are worth your weight in gold. Because if you estimate something and it turns out that you are proven time after time after time, that will offer you big numbers, big dollars to come work for them. Because one of the problems with projects is that they always start too optimistic and no one is ever sure of the numbers. But as I said last week, estimates for most project managers are wrong when they put them up. And they know they're wrong. But they will give the closest, best guess that they can and then work really, really, really hard to bring it in by whatever number they said. So if I say something's going to take 40 days, I don't know whether it's 40 days, I don't know whether it's 60 days or 25 days, but I'm going to call it 40. That's my best guess. I will then work really hard to make it look like it was 40 days. Even if it turns out that it's actually a 50-day task list I have to get through, I've got to squeeze those 50 days into 40 days. Now that might mean working late, working 10-hour days on normal work days, potentially working weekends and holidays. But you do it. And at the end of 40 calendar days lapse, someone comes to you and pats you on the back and said, oh, you said that was 40 days and you were spot on. What they don't see is all the work that was done to make it look like that estimate was correct, even though we know it wasn't. Causes of project delay, deliberately overestimating because we don't know at the beginning. As I said, estimates are a guess. Sometimes the guesses are right, sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're close but not close enough. So we build in a buffer. We build in a contingency. If I think something's going to take 10 days, I'll call it 12. I'll put 20% margin against my numbers. A 20% buffer so that if I go over a little bit, it's okay. I've got time to do it. You know, if someone falls down a flight of stairs and breaks their arm, you know, at a critical juncture, and they can't sit on a keyboard, then you may have to find someone else to be able to do it. Maybe not as knowledgeable. It may take them a little bit longer. They can still get the task done, but those extra buffer days that you'd included into your estimate come in handy. Project manager safety margins, because after you've padded them, you look at it and you think, oh, I really don't know. It might go a little bit longer than that, so I'm going to, rather than call it a 2-day buffer and take my 10 days out to 12, why don't I make it 15? So they pad the padding. And other people add to it as well, because their team members, if I ask them, how long will that task take? They know it takes 4 days, but they will call it 5. So I, as the project manager, ask one of my team leads how long a task will take. They will go and talk to their developer. The developer thinks they can do it in 2 days, but they'll call it 3, so they tell their boss 3. The team lead then says, well, I need an extra couple of days or maybe one more day just to make sure. So I will go to my boss and I will call it 4. So it goes to the project manager as 4 days. The project manager goes to their steering committee and says that task will take 6 days. So suddenly a 2-day task has now become 6 days. By the time that it gets up through all of these padding estimates, as everyone brings in their own version of the GST on their particular task estimates. Anticipating cuts from management. If I put up a number that says I need 15 days to do a task, I know my manager will come back and say, Grant, I want you to do it in 12. So if I say 15, I know I'm probably going to get about a 10% to 20% requirement to cut those numbers down. So I will put my padding in at 30 to 40%, knowing that I'm going to lose 20% of it. Except sometimes it doesn't happen. So I've padded my numbers by 40%, expecting it's going to get cut by 20%, only it doesn't. So now I've got 40% overrun or extra time in my project plan, which is great. Except when you add all of these up and you find that your project, in order to deliver this particular product, is now going to take 8 years. So no company in the world is going to give the approval to a project like that. No one's going to say, yes, we'll begin this project now, we'll put $20 million against for something to be delivered in 8 years' time. because in 8 years' time, you're about 7 generations of technology out of date and the world has moved on. You're trying to sell an obsolete product. So this is the danger of padding these numbers. And I've been on both sides of this. I've been in the development role, in the team lead role, in the project management role. So I'm one of the ones that's guilty of padding my numbers whenever I talk to my boss, because I wanted the insurance factor. Yeah.
What's the longest kind of time budget you've ever gotten away with?
The longest time budget I've ever gotten away with was never long enough. Most of the projects that I worked on were always very time constrained, and most of my estimates were given top down. When I would come and do the only one that I did as a bottom up, and I stuck to it, I said a particular project was going to take 18 months. I got told I needed to render that down to 12 months. I say 18 months is the best I can do. We can't do it any earlier. That's with me taking all of my padding out, because originally I said 2 years. And then I took it down to 18 months and I said, that is the absolute knife edge delivery that we can do. And I got told to take it down to 12 months. I said, we can't do it for 12 months. With the resources that we have and the money that is being put up for it, we can't do it. It'll take at least 18. We need more time. And they said, the only reason we're having this project is because we sold it as a 12-month project. So you've got to make the project plan look like 12 months. I said, I can't do it. I got directed to redraw my project plan as a 12-month plan. So on the bottom of the project plan, when I submitted it to the client, I said, this is the absolute most optimistic view of the project plan. If everything goes perfectly and we have no overruns, this is in the footnote, it will come in 12 months. But projects never work that way. And in my final meeting, because I resigned the company not long after this, because I wanted to try and tell the client that this was something I didn't believe in. Wasn't the only reason, there were a couple of other ones, but this was one of them. They were trying to sell an 18-month project as 12 months, knowing it was going to run over and the client would have to pay for it. And I knew the client didn't have the money. The client didn't have the cash to run an 18-month project. This is a project we should have walked away from. Or potentially gone back to them and said, you can't do all of the work that you believe. If we cut it in half and do half of the delivery, only the critical components, we can do that. And I got told, no, it has to be 12 months. The client told me we will only accept 12 months. They put it up to their board of directors as 12 months. They took the footnotes out. I left the company. 18 months later, my company got sued. My ex-company at that point got sued because they hadn't delivered it according to the 12-month plan. Surprise, surprise. The client couldn't finish the project. They didn't have the cash. They got about 80% of the way through, and they still had about a third of the plan left to work on. And the money had run out. They couldn't get more money, at least not easily. So this became a legal matter. So what little money they had left over, they stopped the project and decided to use it to bring the lawyers in and sue my ex-company. I wasn't attached to them by that time. I'd already moved on. I was almost 2 years into another company by then. It was negotiated settlement, which is another way of saying everyone got under a non-disclosure clause and certain arrangements were made to keep it out of the press. Because neither the client wanted this to splash all over the front pages, and my company certainly didn't want it to be splashed all over the front pages, so a handshake agreement would have been organised. Now, because that had been done and it all went away, I don't know what the actual details of the settlement were. I just know it was an arbitrated settlement to stop it going through the legal system, at least any further than where it did. But again, it's not unusual that this sort of thing happens, where you have large consultancies coming in from outside who don't know your business as well as you do, and you're asking them to create a product to help run your business better than it has been in the past. But you're the ones who know the business, not them. They know technology. They know maybe project planning, but they don't know the detail as well as you do. So you need to bring all of the parties together and create a common set of knowledge. And if you don't do that particularly well, especially when you don't listen to the project manager who's telling you we can't do it for that resource and we can't do it in that time frame, and you decide to make up your own time frame and then expect that this imagined result will somehow eventuate, you're living in la-la land, really. What's the use of bringing in an expert to give you some, the benefit of their knowledge and then you discard their knowledge? But this is one of the problems when it comes to estimates, because estimates are not necessarily nailed down through a scientific formula, because when you try and do it, it's wrong. So this padding, this introduction of risk management insurance by taking your numbers and putting a buffer or a contingency on them is pretty common. And there are ways and means of doing this, and I'll freely admit I used to do it all the time. All of my numbers I would pad. Based upon my own experience, I would always put at least 15 to 20% overrun in my numbers. Because I know somewhere along the way, one of my risk mitigation strategies is going to have to be called into play. One of my risk events will be triggered. And while I'm sorting out whatever that issue happened to be, other things in the project plan are going to get held up. So I need to build in that buffer because I know roughly 20% overrun for me was kind of normal. Because no matter how good I am, I couldn't get above about a 15% based on the estimates that I had. I would work really hard to try and make it look more reasonable. But I got very tired of actually, working 12 and 15-hour days to keep intact a number that was a bit of a fantasy at the beginning. You can do it. It's one of the reasons you pay project managers lots of cash if they're good at doing this. Because even if their numbers are wrong, they will work really, really hard over time for free in order to make it look like they were right. So, failure to pass along positive early finishes on activities. Because remember, when we have parallel streams, one of those streams might finish earlier than we expected. Maybe we had 3 things going at the same time, and one of those we estimated to be 5 days, and we actually put a more experienced person on it, and they finished it in 3. We had 2 days left. Do you know usually what happens when we've got a 2-day buffer while we've finished one task and we're waiting for other tasks to catch up to it? So all the prerequisites line up, so whatever's coming next can be started. Sorry? Okay, we've had one suggestion here that if we finish one task early, we put those people onto the other task to hurry them up. I can tell you from fact that doesn't happen. Because what usually happens is it's like, oh, I'm complete now, but I just won't tell anyone. I'll start doing the documentation and I'll have a few long coffee breaks. And I can have a bit of a rest because I've been working really, really hard for the last week. And I'm just going to take it easy for the next day or two. Because I said it would take 5 days. I finished it in 3, so I'm just going to take it easy for the next 2. And when I get to the end of 5 days, well, we're back on track anyway. We haven't lost anything. Except, later on in the project, we could really use those 2 days. If we've fallen behind, if we had been able to move people onto another task, if we had have started one of our non-critical tasks early in order to get in underway, but we don't work that way. I'm sure you do the same thing. I mean, when you're working on an assignment or you're working on a bit of homework or in a group, if you manage to hand it in before the deadline, do you automatically jump on the next series of tasks to get ahead in your subject? Or do you just say, no, I'm just wait and I'll take it easy and go out and party a little bit because I deserve it? Because generally that's what happens. Negative consequences of multitasking. Switch time is overlooked because when you take people off one task and you move them across to another, and this comes back to what you were saying about taking experienced people as they finish a task early and moving them to start somewhere else, you have a switch time. Because you mentally need to move out of the task that you were doing, even if it's finished, and get up to speed on the new one that you're about to begin. You need to do some reading. You need to find out where they fit in the plan. You need to work out who the resources are to help you and how skilled they are. You need to sit down and start planning things out. This switch time, you can't just say, oh, Joe finishes here at 5 o'clock on Wednesday and he starts 9 a.m. on the immediate next task the following day. If this is an area that Joe knows nothing about, there is a learning factor that you need to build in when you switch from one task to another. And we tend to overlook that. So there's another reason for putting this buffer in our task estimates, is because when we switch out of one task into another, we have a time lag where we're getting up to speed again. Delays passed along from activity path merging, and that's when we said when we have these parallel streams coming together. If we're waiting on one task to finish, but it's not ours, someone else is doing it, but we can't start our next task until they're done, we're taking a holiday. We're going to sit at our desk and just take it easy for a little bit until they catch up to us. We could use that time much more productively to push our task list ahead, but, you know, in the non-critical areas, but we're not going to do it because we've been working really hard this week anyway. And student syndrome. Do you know what student syndrome is? This is the real name for it. This is not something I'm making up. This is actually a real thing. Student syndrome. What's student syndrome? Anyone have an idea? Sorry? Bad? Start the night before the due date. That's actually, yeah, that's pretty close. Student syndrome is deliberate procrastination. Waiting until the last minute to begin things. I mean, how many of you started assignment 1 in the last week before the due? Yeah, got a few hands going up. Not unusual. But assignment 1, I published it in the preparation week, in week 1. It wasn't due for 5 or 6 weeks, but most people would have probably started it 1 to 2 weeks before the deadline was actually arriving. You had a month to work on it before that, but most people probably didn't. How many people have started assignment 2? Started writing it up? Okay. It's due in 4 weeks. It's due in 1 month. And I can guarantee you there will be groups that will try and start it about 3 to 4 days before the due date. And they'll try and put 10,000 words together in 36 hours. And guess what? That's the time the printer runs out of ink. Murphy's Law. The printer will jam. You'll run out of paper. The ink will not work. Whole lots of different reasons. And this is supposed to be a relatively professional document, and I can guarantee I'm going to get loose leaf with a staple or something in the corner rather than having it nicely bound. Or I'm going to have someone that's just put a bull clip on it. Now, would you give a report, a professional report to a client with just a bull clip on the corner holding it together if this is a document that's going to get tabled to a steering committee that determines the entire future of your company? I can guarantee you, some of you will run out of time, and that's exactly what we're going to get. For those of you who might be tempted to have a look at other previous reports from other semesters and just crib pieces out of that, please don't do it. Write your own documents, because we have a big push in the university on misconduct at the moment, and if it turns out that your document is plagiarised from somewhere else, from a previous student or a previous group or a previous assignment, we will, not maybe, not if, we will, we have no choice, we will put you up on misconduct charges, which means it goes to the governance unit, and after that it's out of our hands. The university decides whether to continue with you or not. Please don't do it. I've seen a few students that have come through and tried to do this in the last 12 months. It is much more hassle than it's worth. So fair warning. I don't like to see students have to suffer through this and potentially have their candidature and their enrolment discontinued, but I have seen it happen. So if you want to look at previous reports, that's fine. Don't copy them. Don't put your own names on them. And then submit it again. We will catch you. Student syndrome. Let's go back to something more happy. Okay. This is how things work. And believe me, this is a human behaviour. This is a heuristic. This is how humans think and act. So if you have 0 through to 100% of your time, whatever time it happens to be, 5 weeks, 6 weeks to the next assignment, assume you've got 0 to 100%. You've also got 0 to 100% up on the angle there, on the upright, as to how much of it you're finished. In a perfect world, it's a 45-degree slope, where when you get through 50% of your time, you should, in theory, be finished 50% of the deliverable. Yes? In theory. This is what really happens. Because at the beginning, if the deliverable is 3 months away, oh, that's too far, we've got plenty of time, I can have long coffee breaks, I can come in late, I can go talk to my friends, I can go out partying, you know, and then 2 weeks have gone by, and it's like, I've still got plenty of time, we're still, you know, 2.5 months away, and then a month and a half goes by, and it's like, oh, I should start thinking about it, maybe I'll start putting a few ideas down on paper somewhere for me to, you know, flesh out later on. And then you suddenly realise this thing's due in a week. And in that last week, you don't sleep, you eat takeaway, and you try and pull it all together very, very quickly. You cram the deliverable as much as you possibly can. Because this is how things work. So 50% of your time is already gone, and you've done maybe 15% of the work. This is when you're working with deliverables that are far out. Human behaviour says we won't take it urgency. It's not an emergency until it is an emergency. And this is called student syndrome. That is the real name of it. Because this is how students operate. I know, I used to do it myself when I was going through my studies way back when. You know, back when Noah was putting animals on the ark. You try and do everything in the last segment of time. Even though you've had all of this time earlier, you've kind of let it lapse. It's not a good thing. You don't get a quality deliverable out of it. So from a project perspective, we can't afford that, so we introduce what we call milestones. So in a perfect world, we have our 45-degree slope. In the real world, we have this bended curve, but the way humans perceive time is we pay no attention to something that's a far distance away. But if it's within 3 to 4 days, we focus on it. If we have a delivery of something in 3 to 4 days from now, we get cracking on it. We regard that as urgent. So the idea of milestones is you set up, rather than one big deliverable at the end, which in a project sense might be 18 months away, we set up individual, closer deadlines. The end of a particular phase of the project or a particular section of activity. This is one of the benefits of Agile, because Agile works just this way. You've got a 30-day sprint, for example, which means you have a deliverable at the end of that month. You absolutely have to deliver at the end of that month. But you also have a deliverable by the end of this particular day, right now. And this is one of the beauties of an Agile approach to doing projects, is because it instills that sense of urgency. If I have to deliver something that's going to be measured by the end of today, I will work on it. If the entire software module is supposed to be working by the end of the month amongst my team, I've got to make sure everyone else is doing their piece as well. Because if it doesn't work in 30 days' time, irrespective of whether I've done my bit or not, as a collective effort, it would have failed the milestone. So the idea here is to try and bring the focus into a whole group of closer delivery dates. Because this makes use of human behaviour. Rather than this procrastination that says nothing's urgent, we don't have to work on it until we're almost up on the deadline, we try and move the deadlines closer and again make use of human behaviour that says if something's urgent, I'm going to put focus on it right now. So this is the idea of project milestones, to focus the group. Now, I can pretty much guarantee that if in our tutorials I had a delivery deadline for you each and in each group every single week, not just the group doing the report that week, but every single student every single week, and you were marked on it, I could pretty much guarantee that you would be doing it, because you would see that if you're not doing it, that you're losing marks. The very fact that not every time do you have to get in front of a group and create a report that is marked means that some of you, once you've got your report done, are probably sitting and relaxing. Except for the fact we're taking attendance in your tutorials. So that also contributes to your participation mark. I don't take attendance in the lectures. So the marks that you get from me at the end are really an accumulation of the other marks that come through from assessment items, but I don't check to see who's here at class each week. We do that in the tutorials. And from my walk around at the tutorials are pretty much always full. Most people turn up. Here in the lectures, we're lucky if we get maybe a third of the students turning up. Because again, that's a human behaviour factor. And believe me, I understand that. It's kind of tough to come in and have a lecture and listen to me drone at you on a Thursday night at 7:30 until 9 o'clock. You've got other better things to do. I understand that in a lot of cases. However, the thing is that we have seen from past experience that the people who do regularly turn up to the classes are the ones who generally don't fail. Now, you can take that statistic because the ones who usually have to repeat classes are the ones who skip lectures. So even though you think that you can read the notes, you can go to the tutorials and pick up everything, you may find it a little bit more difficult to do that. You actually absorb knowledge whether you know it or not. Even if you're sitting there, you know, checking your SMS and, you know, I don't know, doing Sudoku on your laptop, while I'm talking at you, in the back of your mind somewhere you're picking up a few comments as we go through that can come back and you might just happen to remember it at the time that question comes up on the exam. Resource considerations. How are we going for time? Okay. Having now our ideal project plan, we've created our Gantt chart, we've created our network diagram, we've put in the milestones, we know exactly what we have to do, we've got our task list, our risk registers, they're all sorted out. We now have to think about constraints. The biggest constraint we have is resources. The theory of constraints. 2 bullet points make up the theory of constraints. The first, most problems stem from a very small number of causes. So if you don't correct the problem at the beginning, it spawns a number of other issues as time goes by. It gets harder and harder to then realise what the original problem was. You end up trying to correct all of the symptoms and all of the spawned problems rather than the original cause. While you don't correct the original cause, it is still spawning more problems as you're trying to get rid of them. Second bullet point, every system has a constraint or bottleneck. You will never remove all of the constraints. Never. Even if I were to give you 5 times the budget you asked for, I were to give you all of the expertise you need, I were to give you lots and lots of time to do what you need to do, something's going to happen. The printer's going to jam or run out of ink. The person you counted on to do a part of your report goes off sick that week through no fault of their own, or they fall down a flight of stairs. Something's going to happen. It'll be the unforeseens, the unknown events that will trip you up. All of the planning in the world won't cater for the unforeseen events. You don't know what you don't know. So this is where it comes into play. The theory of constraints says try and catch the problems and identify them early before they create other problems. And the second one is there's always a problem. What you should be doing then is always looking for problems. Just because nothing has happened doesn't mean you don't have a problem. It might just mean you haven't found it yet. You know, one of the most stressful events for a project manager during the course of their project is when they come in the morning and they check their risk register and they check their Gantt chart and they talk to all of their people and they have their stand-up meetings and they talk to their project sponsor and everything is fine. That is one of the most stressful events for a project manager. Because they sit there thinking, what have I missed? What haven't I found yet? What's waiting to come and bite me that I haven't detected yet? When they're dealing with problems, it's okay. We can work on those. But when everything is running smoothly, that can be a very stressful event for a project manager, because they have the natural inclination, they have a mindset that they're problem solvers. When you suddenly don't have any problems, it's not that all of the problems have been solved. If anything, it's that we have a whole bunch of sneaky problems that I haven't found yet. That also makes them good project managers, because generally there are a whole bunch of sneaky problems out there that they haven't found yet. So just because you think everything is running fine, that's the time you go looking for the problems. You go looking for the ones that you haven't spotted yet. Most constraints will be based around resources. What resources do we need? What resources are available in short supply or just not obtainable? How do we bridge the gap? Because we need certain resources, money, time, people, expertise, technology, whatever it happens to be, in order to deliver what we promised. So in order to actually create the product that we promised that we could create with the resources that we have now, we know it's never enough, how do we bridge the gap? These are some of the concerns that a project manager has when they start thinking of the theory of constraints. And they usually come down to the same things. The resources in a software environment are usually these: labour, tools, equipment, materials, space, services, time and money. I'll put an exclamation mark after money, because if you have enough money, you can often buy some of the others. If you need more space, you can go and rent more premises. If you need more technology, you can go and buy a whole bunch of new service, if you have money. Money is the catch-all resource. It allows you to go out and purchase other resources, but it won't work every single time. You might think that you've got to go out and get a particular product skill set by going and hiring or recruiting someone, only to find that there's no one available. Sometimes the technology just isn't available either. I mean, if your entire project was premised on the fact of a Star Trek matter transporter being able to move you from here to there, well, I'm sorry, we don't have that yet. That technology doesn't exist. So you've got an immediate constraint. If you promised a project plan based on the fact that teleportation was real, yeah, you've got an issue. No matter how much money you throw at that, that won't turn up anytime soon. So when we take a look at resource management, we go through a step-by-step process. The first one, resource determination. What are the resources and the time needed from start to finish for each of the tasks that we have to do and for each of the projects that we're allocated to? Point two, resource acquisition. Once we've determined what resource we need to go out and get them. Hire them, buy them, rent them, recruit them, whatever the resource happens to be. We need to find a source for whatever the particular resource happened to be. And it may require additional tasks and risks being added to the project plan, because if we don't have a way of getting this resource, that becomes a risk if the project is dependent upon us having that in place. If we're not able to recruit the skill set, or the hardware that we ordered won't be delivered for 3 months because the factory in Japan or wherever burnt down and they need to get it from somewhere else, then that could be a problem. Once we've acquired the resources that we need, then we need to allocate them out. And this is what's called resource loading. Assign or schedule a resource amount for each specific time period, and you do this on a Gantt chart. 2 levels, you've got the total project and for each task, and that requires you having a pretty detailed work breakdown structure. A usage table shows flaws and overcommitment. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then once we've done the resource loading, which is the allocation of the resources, then we need to see how realistic it is. And this is what's called resource levelling, where we smooth out the constraints across the project lifecycle. Let's take a look here. Here's a resource loading table created by a project manager for John, one of their resources working on the project. And it's for the month of February, weeks 1 through week 4. John will be working on 8 tasks. Myself as a project manager, I have allocated John to work on these 8 tasks and complete these 8 tasks during the course of the next 4 weeks, assuming this is the beginning of February. What is wrong with this table? Can anyone look at it and tell me what is wrong? John is doing an insane amount of work in week 2. Yeah. He's got a pretty easy life in week 1. He's working 9 to 12-hour days in week 2. 8 to 9-hour days in week 3, which is over and above, but not too bad. And then he's hardly doing anything else in week 4. Now, on the 12th of February, I've got John working a 12-hour day. Really? Do you think John's going to like me when I tell him to do that? Probably not. Most days, most working days are only about 6 to 7 hours. You can't get more productive time out of people. Most resource tables work on the basis of allocating a task to someone that they can do within 6 hours, or only have 6 hours of productive work out of them. The other time is lunch hour, bathroom breaks, maybe a smoko break, maybe just down the street running an errand. 6 hours productive time is about normal. You can sometimes get 7 out of them, but you'll usually find that when project managers start creating a loading table for their team members, for their project team, they will work on 6 hours, maybe 7, depending on how much work and how important the work happens to be according to the deadline. You'll notice here those closed square brackets. That is the time that the task has to be finished by. So, for example, if you look at the 19th of February, you'll see on task number 2, we've got John finishing it on the 11th, but he didn't actually have to finish it until the 19th. John has a week of slack in there where this task can move back and forwards. But if you look down at task 7 for the 19th, it says that he absolutely has to finish that task because that's where the square bracket is. On the 19th, this task has to be done. And he's been working on it, through the 16th, 17th, 18th and 19th for 4 hours each. But he has to be finished on that day, so no slack time in that one. So this is the next thing. Once we've loaded John down with work, we then have to take a second pass at the table and try and figure out how we're not going to kill John with overwork. Because the thing is, I've got John working above and beyond for 2 weeks. Now, I said the average is about 6 to 7. I've got him working an average of between 9 and 12 on most of those days. John's going to hate me. John will be looking for a new job by the end of week 2. I mean, how many jobs do you think would be great if your boss came to you and said, yeah, look, I really need you for the next period of time to just not sleep, to not eat, and not go home. And I need you to be fully productive in the 12-hour days that I'm now allocating you. So no downtime at all. You can ask people to work above and beyond their normal capacity for a period of time, and if they like you, they will do it as a favour. But sooner or later, in spite of the best intentions, even if they want to work harder for you, they will burn out. They will start losing productivity just because they get exhausted, if for no other reason. If they don't like you, they will basically give you the big middle finger or start sabotaging your work, or telling you they're working 12 hours when in fact they're actually mucking about for about half of that. So this is one of those things where you need to keep your project team on side, because on the occasions when you do need them to work above and beyond their normal capacity, if you have done the right thing by them, they will do it. But you can't keep doing it as a regular thing. So this is wrong. We need to go back and take a look at it. And it's pretty easy because we have some time up our sleeve. So assuming that we're going to set a target of no more than 7 hours of productive work during the day. As I said, generally it's about 6, but hey, this is an intensive project, so I'm going to call it 7. I have some slack time built into my tables here. Because task number 2 doesn't need to be finished until much later, and task number 5 doesn't have to be finished until later, task number 6 doesn't have to be finished until later, I've got some slack time and I can start moving things around And what I end up with then is something a bit closer to a reasonable working day. So by moving some of these tasks and their starting and end positions about a bit, I get roughly a 7-hour working day. John can live with this. He doesn't have to work 12-hour days. He gets to go home and talk to his children. He gets to remind his wife that, yes, she is still married. She's not a widow. She hasn't been divorced when she didn't know. These are the things that you have to do as a project manager. So this is a levelled resource loading table. So this is the difference between loading up someone with the work and actually levelling out to get the most productivity out of them, to balance them, smooth things out. So when it comes to resource management, we need to manage the constraints. The constraints often being people and what they know. Identify the system constraint. Exploit the system constraint. In other words, take note of it, give it attention, and work out what you're going to do. Subordinate everything then to removing the system constraint. Make it a priority. If this is a key constraint and we need to resolve it in order to move forward, then let's resolve it as best we possibly can. Elevate the system constraint, put it up at the highest priority in order to be able to work with it, deal with it, fix it, and then reevaluate. Because once this one goes away, all it does is let the next highest priority bubble to the surface. So you start working on the next constraint. And you go back through it again, identify what the next system constraint is, put it up as the highest priority and work around the system again. And you keep doing this. And the intention is you won't get rid of all of the constraints, but you can try and get rid of the ones that are going to hurt you the most. Get rid of the high impact ones. Get rid of the constraints that will stop the project delivering as best you possibly can. There'll be other ones that will actually slow you down or use up more resource than you intend. But the intention here is focus on what the priorities are. So the first thing you have to do is identify what those priorities are. Options for resource planning. Here are a few thoughts. If you've got expertise that you need, you've got a project plan that says we're going to deliver in 12 months, but I've only got 10 people working on my project, and in order to deliver in 12 months I need 20, one of the options is you go out and hire another 10. They don't have to be full-time. They can just be part-time. You bring them in at the point you need them. So rather than hiring a database specialist that you only need for 1 week in a 3 months' time, you just hire them for that 1 week rather than for 3 months. And you have them do what you want them to do during that time. Contractors, you'll often find contractors on projects for the very reason that they're great as polyfiller. They can fill the gaps in your project plan and cater for some of the unforeseens. When someone goes off sick, you can go and hire another resource and bring them in. And it doesn't necessarily even need to come from an outside source. It can be that you've got a relationship with another project manager across the floor, and you can go and talk to them and say, hey, you know, Susan, my database analyst, has gone off sick for 3 days. I really need someone to work with my team on sorting out some database issues. Can I borrow one of yours for 3 months? For 3 days. And I will pay you back by giving you some resource when you need it in a month or 2. There's a lot of favour trading that goes on. It's one of the beauties when you actually do have multiple projects running, rather than just one big project, is that you'll find that the project managers talk together because they know that they can't do this in isolation or by themselves, and they look for favours that they can trade around between them in order to help each other out. Because if you have a project manager that never talks to anyone else outside of their project team, when something goes wrong, there's no one to come along and help them. Utilise float to balance resources. We talked about float and the critical path. If you have lag time, if you have slack time built into your project team, don't just leave it sit there as a holiday for people. If someone's not actively engaged with doing work because they finished early or their task has been delayed because someone else has to do a prerequisite first, find other things for them to do. Put them to work. It doesn't have to be a critical task, but it's a task that's on the project plan. Try and tick it off by having someone work on it. Except sometimes people will be idle and overloaded. Sometimes you just got to work weekends. Sometimes you just have to work late. It's a normal run. You know, when I was in project environments, it was pretty standard. Sometimes you just work late. Yeah?
In moments of them being idle and using flow, wouldn't that be part of the whole favor trading thing? Like, you wouldn't want to give the database analyst that you were mentioning when they're already overloaded, but if they're idle, then that's almost handy as a favor.
Yep. The question here is you've got to be careful about how you've already allocated people, because if someone is already overloaded and you give them more work, it's just going to burn them out much more quickly. If they're idle, that's a different story, but this is where the favour trading comes into play. You'll find projects run on favour trading all the time. It's the currency of projects.
What I was actually saying was it might actually be a good thing in the sense that the person is idle who use the fact that...
Okay, as a stopgap. Yeah, so the suggestion was if someone who's a critical resource does have idle time, that's actually good, because we can then use them to fill gaps elsewhere in the project plan. If someone else is running overtime or whatever, we can use the experienced person who's got some free time to help out, and that's very true. And sometimes you don't necessarily have John work 12-hour days or 10-hour days. You like to have him work with less experienced people for maybe 2 hours a day. I used to do that, actually. I had a couple of very experienced consultants that I used to just flip around projects all the time. On Monday, they'd be on one project. On Tuesday, they'd be on another. And over the period of a week, they'd work on about 4 different projects because they were so good. They could walk in and solve a problem in an hour that might take a less experienced person 3 days. So some of my most experienced people, not all of them, but some of them I would keep free so that they could go and move between projects and help out where needed. And I often left it to their own discretion as to where that would be. But you have to have a lot of trust. I actually did that with another person who was, I remember one guy, I did that, was brilliant. I remember I did it with another guy who was very good on hardware and operating environments. And I trusted him to move around his project team. And I only found out about 5 months after I had him start doing this that he was spending at least half of each day down the casino. So we would go into a client in the morning, spend about 2 hours with them, and he would, make it look like he's at the client all day, but by lunchtime he's already over at the casino. Needless to say, when I found out about that, he had no leg to stand on and he left the company. So sometimes when you give people trust, it works, and sometimes doesn't. I tend to work on the most optimistic view on that. You have to trust people. It's the way to get a project done. But sometimes you have to have informed trust. Trust but verify. In the first case, it worked so well with one of my senior consultants, I didn't worry about verifying it with others. I just assumed that they were as professional, and in one particular case I got let down. That happens. Consider the relative expertise of the team members, because if you put a trainee on it, it could take them a long time and they can hold up other people who are waiting on their task to finish. You put an experienced person on it, they can knock it over very quickly. So it's not only about the available time of someone, it's the expertise of the person involved, and you can use that in your balancing as well. Prioritise or remove non-critical tasks. This is one thing. You'll often find that there are lots of things in a task list that you may not necessarily need. They're there for risk management. They're there as a nice to have. They're there because you want to show value to the client. Rather than having 3 meetings about a particular topic, try and do it in one. Take the other 2 meetings away and put the team onto more relevant activity. And again, this is what Agile is all about, is to try and make sure that people are working on real work all the time. It's one of the benefits of Agile. Extend the activity time and potentially the project time. And this is one way of guaranteeing you can get your project tasks done, but it will generally blow your time window. But remember what I said, at the beginning of the project is when you know least about it. So your estimates based upon the least amount of information will often be wrong, sometimes very wrong. As more information starts to flow through the project, as you move further into the project life cycle, you will have more accurate information. That means your estimates become tighter and better about a particular task. As you get that additional information to help you tighten your estimates up, you may have to go back and ask for extended time, or take certain requirements right out of scope in order to keep the timeline intact. That is never a good thing when you do it. If you have to go and ask for more time in order to finish your project, then people will start to think you don't know what you're doing. But again, it's endemic to the fact that you don't necessarily know everything at the beginning of the project. You may just have to live with it as best you possibly can. When you make an estimate as to a task and how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost, do it as an informed thing. Don't just make a number up. Have a reason for why you chose a particular number. Okay, use more money. As I said, money can pretty much coder for most things. Cost management. Relationship of the work breakdown, structure, scheduling and budget. To assess a plan, it is vital to understand costs. Costs should be justified as part of the business case, and determining costs magnitude must be carried out critically. The work breakdown structure gives you the list of task activities to do. The budget says whether I have the money to actually do them, and the schedule says whether I can do for that money that particular task in the time frame. So these things have a relationship. Cost management. Project cost management includes the processes to ensure that a project team completes with an improved budget. Because the thing is, at the beginning when you're doing all these estimates, you put it up as a budget and someone says, yes, we'll sign that off, that's $1 million. After that, you're stuck with it. Even if you find out later that it's $1.5 million that you should have asked for, because this is a lot more complicated and complex than you thought, you're still stuck with $1 million budget. You're still going to be $500,000 short. So you need to start planning out where you're going to spend your money and take things out that are just going to cost you without giving you any extra value. Cost planning is similar to time planning. As we do with time planning, and we talked about last week, we need to also do with money. Top down, bottom up and parametric, using the work breakdown structure, and that's cost estimating, which is very different from cost budgeting, which is when you allocate the estimates that you've created to a time frame. So when you do cost estimating, we say database labour is going to be $10,000. The budgeting for that is that $10,000 might be spread over 1 day a week for 3 months. So the elements of cost: labour, materials, equipment, indirect expenses such as transport, training, etc. Overheads: office fit out, creating a project room, getting the technology set up, admin, and you do have a contingency in there for risk management. Okay, we're almost near the end. This is the accounting part of the lecture. Let's have a look at our famous test results report and our famous 8 tasks again. So, sample project cost estimate table. We have come up as the project manager with an estimate, as we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, of $83,500 in order for this particular piece of the project to be done. I've allocated it to labour for each of the tasks. I've allocated equipment, indirect costs because maybe we need to send someone out to train people or do testing in other capital centres. And the total cost for each of the tasks adds up to $83,500. So this is our cost estimate based upon resources. We then take those estimates of $83,000 across our task list and we put them on a schedule. And this is our cost budget baseline. So this is the difference between estimates, or an estimate baseline or an estimate table, and the actual budget table. In the budget table, we're putting it on a calendar. So the test results report 1.1, we're spending $7,500 in the first week, and we need to make sure that that money is there. Because what this tells us is, in the bank account, we need $22,500 for week 1, we need $42,500 for week 2, $11,500 and so on and so forth. because if that money isn't in the bank account for that week, I can't pay my contractors, and therefore we can't do the task list with associated with that week. I need a budget in order to be able to fill these weeks with activity. So the estimates for all of my resources give me 83,500. It gives me a total that I then just break down and put across a calendar for the same tasks. And that's the budget. You do the same thing, I'm sure. I mean, if you're renting an apartment or renting a house somewhere, you've got to work out how much you're paying for food this week, otherwise you don't eat this week. How much are you doing for transport? You know, how much you're putting for petrol in the car or paying for your train fare. How much is your rent? How much do you need to pay if you buy your lunch? You do this every particular week, and you've got to make sure that there's enough money in the bank account for you to do these things. So you're used to budgeting. You may not have really thought about it, but if you don't have money in the bank account to pay for food, you don't eat, unless you either steal it or borrow from somewhere else. So this is the difference between an estimate table and a cost budgeting table. A few final words. We're almost there. Resource management is an iterative process. You tend to go back through it many times. You continually reevaluate resource and planning. Resources allocation and invariably lengthen the plan from the first ideal plan made without resources. When you first start estimating things, remember, you don't worry about resources, you just do it on sequencing. But once you start putting resources around it, you'll generally find that you don't have enough resources to do everything that you want in the time frame, and that means that you need to stretch the plan out over along the time. Balance activities, resources, time, cost and risk, and it is a balancing act. Labour is often the most expensive part of